Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be discussing the book The Raven Scholar. This is a new fantasy release that has somewhat taken both BookTube and BookTok by storm. It is already very beloved. A lot of people are pointing to this as not only their favorite read of the year, but also a standout for new fantasy from not just this year, but the last few years. And I was very excited based off of the synopsis for this one. I thought it sounded really intriguing. There were aspects to it that seemed like it was going to be a genre blender. And what it ended up being wasn't exactly what I was expecting, and I wanted to chat through why, but I also, in case you haven't really heard too much about it, do want to start by giving a heads up about why I think it's so well loved and why it's really clicking for a lot of people, and then we'll get into some of the specifics as to why it turned out to not be what I was expecting. Kicking things off with the general synopsis and setup for the story, we follow a young woman named Nima, who is a scholar who has come from what is considered within their society a lowly background. She's just seen as a commoner, and thus her rise through the ranks of the scholars is almost an offense to a lot of people who come from more prestigious backgrounds. And because of this, she feels really determined to not only excel at her work, which she genuinely does enjoy, but also she has a little bit of an extra push to try and prove to everybody that she belongs. And she recognizes too that the ability for commoners to work within their system, which we'll get into in just a second, that was actually one of my favorite parts of the story, but their ability to enter into this class structure is something that is very much on edge. They know that easily, especially once the current emperor is replaced, that their ability to learn and to partake in their society in professions like the one she has as a scholar, they are at risk. So she feels like it is on her shoulders to prove that she deserves her place, but maybe selfishly she also doesn't care all that much about being somebody who stands out as a significant figure and somebody who's meant to represent the common people, but she actually just sort of really likes this job and doesn't want to lose it. And this very much comes to the forefront when, at the beginning of the story, you have these two siblings who have had almost like a version of banishment for a while. They've been protected for quite a while after their father had tried to lead a rebellion against the current emperor. And now that they have reached the age of 16, they are no longer under that protection, and so they are going to be essentially tried. And they're also going to see how much they maybe knew about their father's rebellion, even though they were only 8 years old when that rebellion took place. And after the sentence has come down upon these two siblings, our scholar is faced with the decision of whether she carries out the sentence. And it is upon the scholars, who are known within the Raven house, we'll call it, because there is almost like a house system. And the Ravens are the ones responsible for essentially copying down these sentences. And if she goes through with this, she knows that it's not really fair what's been passed down, but also this is the opportunity for her to secure her place. And then that is where the beginning of the story ends, and then you kick off with the bulk of the story. So the opening is very edge of your seat. It very much establishes the stakes right away. You see that this is a system that doesn't necessarily have the best justice system in place, and also there's a lot to do with how their society is set up, where not just because of the houses and how that breaks down people into groups, but also it seems they're very comfortable breaking people down into groups based off of things that they can't really control, like their class. From there, we segue into the main plot of the story, which is following Nima a number of years later. She seems to have secured a position based off of the decision she made at the beginning. And a lot of people do not like the decision that she ended up making, but she tries to just brush it off her shoulders, even though it is somewhat of a lonely existence. And she's just trying to keep her head down and really dedicate herself to her work. But we have the opportunity for a new emperor to come into place, and the new emperor comes into place based off of a series of trials. And there's a representative, a contender from each of the houses, of which there are 8, although there's one that doesn't really count, which we'll get into in a second, but there are 8 different houses, and there are contenders that compete to become the next emperor. And this is where you're going to see somewhat of that trials component to the story. I know that's a big thing in a lot of fantasy books. I would say in recent years, this has been more present in young adult stories, but it does pop up from time to time in adult fantasy as well. Things like Gideon the Ninth, for example, we do see there being some kind of somebody has to compete against other people to ascend to some kind of position of power. So if you're somebody who likes the trials components of stories, that was present here. I don't think it played such a big role that it was the main focus. It was kind of actually something that was happening in the background. It was certainly something that kept the plot moving. Like there was always something almost tangible, you could say, for the characters to do. So that pacing was there. But the mystery component of this story picks up when one of the contenders is found dead, and specifically found dead by Nema. And based off of some things that happened the night before, Nema doesn't really remember the events from the previous night and fears that she herself might have actually been the one responsible for killing one of the contenders. And she is so worried that she committed this horrible act. But she's also the one put in charge of the investigation, and she's been selected to replace the dead contender and participate in these trials, even though she's not really qualified whatsoever. She's not been training, and she very much has no desire to ascend to the throne. A little bit about the world building before we kind of bounce off of that and talk about more of the specifics with the writing and the pacing and all of those things. The world building is interesting in that you have, as noted, this house system, and each of the houses is represented by a certain kind of animal that they see as this deity. A lot of people who are more religious minded, they do not want the gods to come back, and actually the gods themselves, based off of their lore, also don't want to come back, because if they do, it would be essentially catastrophe for all parties involved. And the way that the gods would come back is if this mythical dagger was used to shed blood. And it is believed that this dagger is the one that was used in the murder of one of the contenders. So a lot of the more religious people within their society also fear that there is going to be somewhat of this apocalyptic event that's going to come about if indeed all of the lore has proven true. So with the houses though, and the various different contenders, a lot of the people within each of the houses have characteristics that are true to whatever given house they belong to. So if you belong to the house of the ox, you're seen as somebody who's very loyal and steadfast and strong, somewhat like a bodyguard type. If you are part of the ravens, you are scholarly and you care about history and you care about the documenting of events to preserve. If you're part of the fox group, you are very much a trickster. So you understand the idea behind this, and people dedicate themselves to these houses and often represent these traits. Where you have the one outlier is the House of the Dragon, and interestingly, where people dedicate themselves willingly to the other houses, the House of the Dragon is different in that it's the only one where people themselves don't really have a choice. If you show signs that you are belonging to the House of the Dragon, then you are taken off to where they are, and then it's very secretive and you don't know a whole lot about that, but they are essentially removed from the competition to become the next emperor. They seem to have their own situation going on, and also they're the only ones really that prove that magic actually does exist in some fashion. This is not a book where you have a strong set magic system. It's not like within the trials people are using lightning and fire against each other or anything like that. It's not set up that way. You don't have magical powers associated with the house that you belong to, except for with the dragons. They seem to have some kind of powers. So they're seen more like witches in a sense. And these are all the elements of the story that I thought were really interesting, really engrossing. Also, there's a lot of lore with all of the various different individuals who belonged to certain houses in the past and how they kind of collided against each other or worked together, or how some of the lore came to be. And you're trying to piece together what has actually proven true and what is something that has developed over time and turned into something that is essentially this myth. You have to try to piece that together because it does seem to be impacting the events of present day. All of that, I thought all of that was fantastic. I can absolutely see for people that feel like they've been deprived of lore-heavy stories or stories that have any kind of cool house system, of which I think a lot of us, especially if we're into court intrigue, really, really love and we don't really get tired of. And if you just feel like you haven't had that in your fantasy, or specifically I should say your new fantasy releases, in a long time, I can 100% see why you would really be gripped by this story. And those were the parts of the story that I found the most interesting. I do wish we had actually gone a little bit further with that stuff because I really, really enjoyed it. But also, I don't think that by any means it didn't do enough. There was a lot to it. It's a pretty long book as well. So it's not like, oh, we had time and we just didn't. I mean, this is a book that's over 600 pages long. So we certainly got into it with the lore. But again, I'm just somebody who really likes lore, so I wouldn't have minded a little bit extra. Also, while you're trying to discern what pieces of the lore are true and which aren't, Nima is doing the same thing while also having to lead this investigation and participate in these trials. So Nima very much has her hands full and does not really feel qualified or prepared for anything that's thrown at her. So she's very much a fish out of water in a sense, and she's just doing her best and scrambling to try and get things done. And one of the things that made this book not necessarily quite up my alley, unfortunately, is that based off of everything that I thought I was getting from the beginning of the story, based off of all of this setup, I thought that the tone was going to be a little bit different, and I thought I would like Nima a little bit more, and with those two things, it ended up not exactly working for me, and I want to give some details as to why. I also just found that besides Nima, I didn't really like a lot of the side characters. I felt that at times they were almost too much of caricatures, and I understand that they represent certain characteristics based off of their houses, but that was really dialed up maybe a little bit more than I would have wanted. And I also think I would have actually appreciated more subtlety between the character types, because everybody had sort of a similar way of being represented. It just sort of felt like the characters represented whatever traits from the houses that they belonged to. They represented those things, and then I wanted to dig in a little bit more into their personalities a little bit more, and it just kind of always felt like it was up here. Granted, we don't necessarily have a ton of time because the book transpires over the course of only really a few days after you get past the beginning section that I described earlier, and I recognize that you don't have time to get into a lot of those things, so you are really only going to see a little bit of them. But that's the kind of story that I like. I like when we get these deep character examinations. That's not really what this story is. However, I can forgive some of that, and I can be more engrossed in a plot-heavy story if I feel like the plot is moving in a way that I find compelling. And the reason I didn't necessarily find it compelling is because Nima as a protagonist, for me, was shockingly dense sometimes, where I was sitting there thinking, wait, why are you not having this pop into your head right now? How is this the conclusion you're coming to? And some of the side characters who she talks through things with also simultaneously have the same response to things, where they don't really seem to think certain things through as strongly as I would prefer. I'll get into some examples of this in a moment, but I want to touch on the tone first, because I think the tone was the biggest thing that took this from being something I would have enjoyed for the story of what it was, and the kind of fast-paced, fun murder mystery trials sort of story. The thing that sort of took away from that for me was how juvenile a lot of it felt. So these characters range between the ages of late 20s and early 30s. You have a character who has a child. You have characters who remember events from before. I mean, they're adults. They're definitely adults. And I found that it wasn't really feeling like most of them were adults the majority of the time. In fact, I don't know if most of them ever felt like adults for me. They were surprisingly immature oftentimes. And I don't mind if from time to time a character is silly or goofy, or maybe you have that one character who's always a little inappropriate, which certainly one of the side characters is that all the time. But it felt like a lot of them were exceptionally juvenile, hot-headed, didn't really have a lot of maturity to them. So I want to give a specific example. And I also want to note something before I give the specific example. Because of my expectations for this book, based off of the synopsis and also what I was getting at the very beginning, and the fact that there's so much lore, which is pretty present in a lot of adult fantasy works, I thought that the story was going to read a little different, in the sense that I thought it was going to read more like fantasy, and I thought it read more like fantasy romance. And I want to be really clear what I mean by that. This is not a fantasy romance. The plot is not moving forward because of a romantic plotline. So I want to be very clear about that. That is not what's going on whatsoever. However, this book still read to me very similar to how certain popular fantasy romance books read. What I mean by that is, obviously some of the things that people aren't looking for are plots that are motivated by the romance. And specifically, sometimes even if you're wanting to give fantasy romance a try, even if you're open to the idea of there being a prominent love story in the book, you still are frustrated by the tone of the story, the writing of the story, because there is, it seems like, a certain kind that is popular right now in a lot of the ones that are becoming really, really big hits, like From Blood and Ash or Fourth Wing. There's sort of this casual, sometimes a little bit playful, and I would say at times juvenile way of the stories being written. Not all the time. I don't want to have broad strokes here. It's just certain ones have a very, very casual, approachable, digestible writing style so that we can more so focus on the plot, the pacing, the world building, the characters. We can focus on all those things, and the writing is very, very inviting, but sometimes it leans a little bit too casual for my taste, or sometimes it leans a little bit less mature than maybe I'm looking for. And I felt like this book read like a fantasy romance book, just without the romance. And I know that makes it sound like, okay, so it just read like a fantasy book, but there is a certain tone that is present in certain specific popular fantasy romance books that I thought that this contained. So I wanted to read a couple passages that I feel like articulate this. And the reason I'm hitting this point is because this is really where my expectations weren't met, I guess you could say. And that doesn't mean that the book is flawed, just to be clear. It doesn't mean this is an objective bad thing. But if I had known that this is how the book was going to read, I might not have been so eager to pick it up. And as always, I want to ensure that books find their target demographic, that they find the readers that are out there and that are going to love it, which I do think a lot of people will like this. If it already sounds good to you, then hopefully what I'm going to read off doesn't seem like something that's going to dissuade you. But this is an example of what I mean by how the characters think or how they act, or the tone, however you want to categorize it. So there's a character that is just looking at these two other characters who they find attractive. And it said, Cain had to admit she looked hot. They both did. Ravenna was like an evil butterfly, and Rico was like a big, sexy wardrobe that might kill you. And these were both very much Cain's type. Cain had a lot of types. You also see that same character earlier on in the story when our character Nima is trying to determine like who would have a motive to kill this contender, who would do this. And she's kind of trying to process, okay, well, this person was here and this person was here. This person had this alibi. And she's talking to this character, Cain, the one who thinks the one character looks like a big, sexy wardrobe. She thinks of Cain, and she looks at Cain. She's like, well, you were at an orgy. And Cain says, multiple satisfied witnesses. And that's kind of how that character acts the whole time. And if it was just that character, I think I could be like, okay, that character is just a little much, which they are. That character is very much a little much throughout the course of the book. However, I was mentioning that Nima is not, for me, my absolute favorite of protagonists, and so there's a couple of examples of this as well. One of them is that she has a tendency to write out to-do lists, which, hey, I love making to-do lists, so I'm not knocking that. I absolutely love making to-do lists and checking things off, and I like that component of this character. But at times you are shown the things that she will write out, and once again, I'm like, aren't you supposed to be an adult? Because some of what's in this to-do list is potentially spoilery, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have on the screen an image of this part, and I'm going to block out the names of certain characters so that way those things aren't revealed. And if you don't care about the names, or you don't care about spoilers, then you can just listen to me for this section as I read it aloud, because I am going to read aloud with the names. But if you don't want those names revealed to you, then feel free to mute me, and then you can see on the screen with those names blocked out, so that way nothing is ruined for you. And then once those go away from the screen, then you'll know, okay, I can put the volume back on and I'll be good to go. I won't have anything spoiled. So one of the to-do lists, it says, if Nima wrote herself a daily task list, which, as we know, she very much did, it would now look like this. Avoid being killed by Ruko. Check. Avoid being killed by Katzen. Check. Encounter the Raven and refuse to do its bidding. Check. Apologize to Cain and get into his trousers. Check, check. Convince Vabris and the Emperor I am not a threat. Check, question mark. Prevent Ruko from winning the throne / ending the world. X. Cake, question mark, parentheses, stolen. Check. And there was another checklist earlier in the story. And the earlier checklist said, 1. Complete this trial without dying. 2. Visit the armory with Fen and choose weapons. 3. Fight Shao. 4. Visit Gata's apartment. Solve murder. 5. Cake, question mark. And that's fine. But it's not really for me. And I want to be really clear as well that there are times where humor like this can definitely work for me. I mentioned before Gideon the Ninth. I actually feel like this book reminded me a little bit of Gideon the Ninth. It's just I really liked Gideon the Ninth because I felt like Gideon the Ninth had the juxtaposition of a really almost posh at times writing style mixed with super stupid jokes. And the clash of that was really amusing to me. It kind of reminded me of like Monty Python, where you have these characters that are acting very gallant and sophisticated, but they're saying the stupidest of stuff, and I found that very amusing. For me, within The Raven Scholar, I think the reason it didn't quite work is because I didn't feel like we had something to push back up against. Maybe you could say the gravity of the plot and the stakes, but because the stakes are so significant, if anything, it just made me want the characters to take things a little more seriously at times. And on that note, I want to get to... okay, Nima's just not the brightest. When it comes to mystery plot lines, if the whole point is to have a really dumb character... I'm not saying Nima is really stupid, but just to give an example, if the point is that you have a character that's completely clueless, completely stupid, very incapable, and you are watching them stumble their way through this pretty obvious mystery, or sometimes a really compelling mystery, but you're right there alongside them, and you're kind of invited to be witnessing things, like wishing you could be there, being like, what about this? Why didn't you notice this? I think that can work at times. Then you have certain mystery stories where the characters are extremely capable, and you're frustrated because you're like, okay, if they're not even figuring it out, then what the heck is going on? And you're just waiting and waiting and waiting for the reveals. I don't feel like Nima fit in either camp. I feel like Nima was just dense so that certain things later were more of a, oh my gosh, that person did this? What? And it's like, yeah, obviously they was the first person to think of in certain instances. I do really want to articulate, though, that this book does have a lot of fun twists and turns. So I'm not saying literally everything is predictable. That's not at all true, because certain things are really kind of surprising. However, certain things, though, I just wish Nima had thought things through a little bit. And I'm going to give an example. And this one, I feel like in order to really fully articulate, I am going to have to mention a spoiler. It is pretty minor, I think. I don't think that this feeds into kind of like the greater big stuff that you are discovering as you're progressing. But this is an example of Nima just... I'm like, what? Come on. And so if you don't want to hear any spoilers, feel free to skip ahead. I will have a timestamp. But a little setup for this part. So before the murder, the person who is murdered is somebody that Nima is known to not really love. And this is part of why Nima wonders, oh my gosh, did I do this? And the reason she doesn't remember the night before is because somebody used this substance called dragon scale on her. They specifically put it into her bath. And this is something that makes you essentially hallucinate. You don't know what's going on. You're out of your mind for a little while. And it was such a heavy dose that Nima herself could have actually potentially been killed. And this is why she has no recollection of the night before and is very afraid that she was the one who maybe killed this person, this contender. Kane, her friend in the story, is telling her, hey, what about you though? Somebody used so much dragon scale on you last night that you could have died. So you could almost see this as somebody tried to kill you too. And she said, well, nobody could have known that the person who put my bath oil in my bath, which it happened to be dragon scale. She says, well, they couldn't have known that they would use the whole bottle. Granted, the person who put the bath oil, dragon scale, in her bath, it was their first day. So you have a person who has never met Nima before. It's their first day. And they are like, here, I prepared this bath for you. And Nima's like, oh, wow, thanks. You're so nice. I really like this new girl. And then she has all this stuff happen with the dragon scale. Then, oh my gosh, this person is murdered. And then so when Kane is like, somebody maybe tried to kill you, and the fact that she thinks, well, they couldn't have known that the new girl would pour it all in. I'm like, why would you not suspect the new girl Why would you not? That was my first thought, is like, shouldn't we at least question this girl? And instead, when she sees the girl in the morning, she's like, thanks so much for all your hard work. Here's this coin or whatever. She's like being nice to her, and the girl is like, wow, thanks. And I'm like, okay, you gotta talk to her though. You gotta at least ask her, hey, I have some questions for you. Can you tell me? She's gotta at least question. And then this is the part that's kind of a spoiler. It was that girl. So I was like, of course it was that girl. Of course. And there are also other examples of not just Nima being this clueless, but other characters as well. So there's a part where when somebody finds out about the contender who was killed, they're very, very upset about this fact. They're like, what? How? And they're angry. And then later, our characters are suspecting, wait, what if it was that person? And one of the characters says, well, it couldn't have been them. They were really mad when they found out. And I'm like, okay, so should everybody who commits a crime just very guiltily walk around being like, oh dear, she's dead, ha ha ha, good. It's like, no, obviously not. Obviously, you're gonna play it, you're gonna try to make it seem like it wasn't you. It's like they think that if a person doesn't just wave a flag being like, hey, I'm guilty, that it means that they're innocent. And this happened so many times. When Nima is also going through the list of reasons why this person has this alibi, this person couldn't have done it because of this, when she's trying to process and eliminate. When Nima is running through this list, there's another person present who, Kane, the one that has multiple satisfied witnesses, therefore it couldn't have been Kane. But Kane turns to this person who's with them and says, what about you? I don't see you with an alibi. And this person's like, gasp, clutch my pearls. It couldn't have been me. No, I liked them. And then Nima says, don't worry, you're not a suspect. We all heard you talking about how much you like the person that was just murdered. We all heard you talking positively about them last night. And again, I'm like, that's not evidence, though. That's not evidence. You can't be like, well, they got along, so she wouldn't have done this. Because, again, do they want all of the people who are guilty of committing certain crimes to just broadcast it? How do they think people are supposed to act? I don't understand the way that, and the fact that she would just tell her, don't worry, that's not you. I'm not even suspecting you whatsoever. Why would you tell somebody that? Imagine, I can't actually, I'm trying to imagine anybody leading an investigation that way, and I can't fathom it. Perhaps if we'd had a character who read a little bit more capable and a little less dense, I maybe would have been more compelled by the mystery, but I wanted certain more obvious things to at least be thought through or thought of, and I would have not even minded if the character did think of these things and then wrote them out, because that's the thing that she does. She likes to make little lists. Write out certain things, and because of the fact that she's also expected to participate in these trials, and also because there are people around her that don't want her around because she's just this basic commoner, and because of the fact that there are certain people that look at her a certain way based off the decision that she made years ago, I feel like if she wanted to get around to investigating certain things but didn't have the time because there's just so much happening, then I think I would have been more on board with her and how the mystery unfolded throughout the story. But there are times where she's just kind of hanging out with the other contenders, and she's, as she says in her one to-do list, one of her goals is to get in another person's pants. So with that kind of stuff, I just was irritated with her. I found the side character, the one that's the most prominent side character, to be pretty annoying throughout the course of the story. And I do want to note that I compared this to kind of sometimes the tone of certain fantasy romance books. But there are plenty of fantasy romance books that don't read this way, so I want to be clear about that. And then also, I think maybe this, some people would see this as, well, this would have fit really comfortably in new adult if we had a formal new adult age range, or some people might be like, oh, well, maybe that would have read better if it were YA, but it wouldn't really have worked with YA because there is certain content within this that I feel like more so fits adult fantasy, maybe new adult. But I actually feel like what's weird about a possible categorization of new adult with this book is that this book reads less mature than a lot of the young adult stories that I've picked up. So for example, I feel like the Raelian Cycle or To Shape a Dragon's Breath. I feel like those are tackling some pretty heavy themes, and they are doing it in a way where it is inviting to people of various different ages, including people within the young adult age range. So it's weird to me to think that as we would progress from a young adult age range into a new adult age range, that we would get less mature. But I could see this maybe being considered new adult, and it's fine if it's considered adult fantasy. I just want, out of my adult characters, to have them behave in ways that are a little less juvenile, and for them, I would have even taken they're juvenile, but they're exceptionally clever, actually, and it's all a front. And I feel like that was sort of what was transpiring with the character of Cain, where he is meant to be a trickster, and he is meant to seem as though he's flippant about everything, but actually he's constantly in the shadows, and maybe he's just putting on this false front to lull you in. And I can understand that that was, I think, what the attempt was with that character, or at least the execution of that character. But with Nima, I just think she's stupid. I do want to note, though, that I think that the combination of a lot of the background things, the world building things, this is where this book shined, in my opinion, and also where I think people are going to feel it is the most unique. Because while I don't think Trials plotlines are unique whatsoever in fantasy, I don't think they've gone anywhere either. I think they've maintained their position as something present within the genre for a while. And then I also think that we have seen genre blenders like The Tainted Cup, where you have a mystery and fantasy combined. I think that's becoming more prevalent, and I do like this. So I like that component of this. I love the genre benders within fantasy. So I think this accomplished that. It's not the only one that's ever done that, but it had it. And then also kind of like the house system, as I noted before, this is where you're going to get more of like the court intrigue and the lore and the history of this character and what's the relationship between this character and this character. And all of that I found engrossing. And I don't think any of these individual things are especially unique, but I think the combination of these things is. I can't think of too many other books that do all of those things in one story, even if there are a lot of books that do individual pieces of this. So in that sense, I feel like this absolutely is going to fulfill a lot of what people are wanting out of the genre right now. The genre, I would say, by no means is stale. I think we're at an interesting turning point, especially with the formal breaking of fantasy, romance, and fantasy. So now that that's kind of broken apart, fantasy romance is kind of getting its footing. And then I think fantasy now has an opportunity to really have a lot of stories that have different subgenres at the forefront really start to shine, because I think fantasy was in a certain place where fantasy romance was the subgenre that was becoming trendy and popular, and because it's branched out into its own thing, now we have the opportunity for things like mystery fantasy or things like steampunk fantasy. We have opportunities for these other things to become more prevalent, and that's exciting, and I do feel like that this book is showcasing that really, really well. So I'm really excited for what I think that this book is bringing to fantasy. I'm glad that it's resonating with so many people. Obviously, some of the things that didn't work for me are pretty specific to the characters and the tone and maybe certain pieces of the mystery and the plot, but I don't necessarily by any means think that that's going to take away from most people. I think a lot of people are going to be really excited about this one. I think a lot of people have been really excited about this one. Even though it was a miss for me, hopefully it sounds good to you. Hopefully if you pick it up, you will really, really like it. I just wanted to give that heads up about the tone, because I just want to always ensure that people have the right expectations when they're going into a book. And on that note, if you are interested in The Raven Scholar, I'll have it linked in the description bar. Feel free to elaborate on this story more if you want to hype it up and talk about why you absolutely loved it. Feel free to do so. If it didn't quite work for you, you're welcome to elaborate on that. If you want to mention any spoilers, just make sure to write spoilers and then enter so nobody has anything ruined for them. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.